Today, the UFC is the biggest MMA organization in the world, worth billions, filling arenas, and turning fighters into global superstars. But when it all began back in 1993, it looked nothing like what we see today. There were no weight classes, no gloves, almost no rules, and it was marketed as the most dangerous sport on the planet. So, how exactly did the UFC begin? Let's go back to where it all started. In the 1980s and early 90s, martial arts were incredibly popular. You had karate schools, taekwondo, boxing, kickboxing. But one big question remained. Which martial art is the most effective in a real fight? This was the question that the Gracie family from Brazil wanted to answer. The Gracies had developed and mastered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a grappling style that focused on leverage, submissions, and ground fighting. To prove their art was superior, they needed a stage, and that stage became the very first UFC event. On November 12, 1993, UFC 1 took place in Denver, Colorado. The event was designed as a tournament to showcase different fighting styles against each other. The tagline? There are no rules. It featured fighters from all kinds of backgrounds. A kickboxer versus a sumo wrestler, a boxer with one glove versus a Savate fighter wrestlers, karate practitioners, and of course a skinny young Brazilian named Royce Gracie. At just around 170 pounds, Royce was not the biggest or strongest competitor. But he had one huge advantage: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And by using submissions like the rear naked choke and armbar, he shocked the world by defeating much larger and stronger opponents. Fans were blown away. They had expected knockouts, blood, and chaos, and they got that. But what really stood out was Royce Gracie dominating with technique over size. The early UFC answered the question. Skill and strategy could beat brute strength, and suddenly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became one of the most respected martial arts in the world. But there was a problem. The early UFC was brutal. There were headbutts, hair pulling, groin strikes, things you would never see in modern MMA. There were no time limits, no weight classes, and the events often looked more like street fights than professional sport. Politicians, most famously Senator John McCain, called it human cockfighting. Pay-per-view providers pulled out, and many states banned the UFC altogether. By the late 90s, the organization was struggling to survive. That's when everything changed. In 2001, the UFC was bought by the Fertitta brothers, along with their business partner Dana White. They knew the UFC had potential, but it needed structure. So, they introduced weight classes, time limits, a unified set of rules banning things like headbutts and groin shots, mandatory gloves, and medical checks. Slowly but surely, the UFC went from being seen as a blood sport to a legitimate athletic competition. The launch of The Ultimate Fighter TV show in 2005 gave MMA mainstream exposure, and the sport exploded in popularity. From there, superstars like Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, Anderson Silva, Georges St-Pierre, and later Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov helped turn the UFC into a global empire. So, from its crazy beginnings as a no-rules spectacle in 1993, the UFC has grown into a worldwide sports giant. What started as an experiment to prove the power of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has now become a multi-billion-dollar industry with millions of fans. But here's the real question. Would you have enjoyed UFC more in its wild, anything-goes days? Or do you prefer the modern, regulated version we watch today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more MMA history and fight breakdowns.